what is it that makes the best, most effective teams? It was a 4-year study. They had multiple PhD psychologists involved. They surveyed over 50,000 people. They looked closely at the function, the dynamics, and the effectiveness of 180 teams, and they evaluated over 100 variables. There was one variable that rose to the top among all these 100 plus variables that they looked at, and that was something called psychological safety.
I'm Garrett Salpeter, and I believe that the most powerful and transformative way to help people recover from pain and injury, heal from trauma, and reach their highest levels of fitness and performance is to focus on the nervous system. In this podcast, we'll share knowledge from the frontiers of neuroscience and inspirational stories of how applying that knowledge has empowered people from all walks of life to heal, adapt, and grow.
Hello, NeuFit Nation. Welcome to the Undercurrent podcast. And in this episode, I'm going to share with you a talk that I gave at a recent event on the neuroscience of leadership. And at NeuFit, we are applying the principles of neuroscience into daily practice of physical therapy, chiropractic, rehabilitation, performance. So you can imagine I'm interested in the topic and interested in when thinking about the topic of leadership, which is a big topic and important topic, thinking of ways that we can apply lessons from neuroscience into becoming more effective leaders. And in this talk, I'm going to go through, I will have slides actually, so if you can watch this on YouTube, you'll have some extra visual cues that might be helpful. But if you're listening to this on Apple Podcast or on Spotify, I will do my best to narrate in a way where you'll still get nearly a full experience and everything will still make sense. So we should be okay even if you're just listening. And I will, for those watching, share my slides and begin. So the talk is called Wired to Lead: What Neuroscience Reveals About Effective Leadership. To start, I'd like you to imagine two clinics. First is Clinic A, and this clinic is thriving. The staff is engaged, energetic, and they're fully invested in their patients' success. And that energy is infectious. Patients pick up on it. This improves outcomes. It allows the team to collaborate effortlessly. It allows them to share insights, support each other, and continuously improve. They have that growth mindset. Now, in contrast, imagine Clinic B. Even though they have equally skilled therapists, the same types of treatment protocols, and even the same resources, here the energy is flat. The staff feels burned out. They're just going through the motions. Turnover is high. Communication is poor. And the worst part is that patients can sense it. They're less motivated. They cancel appointments, and outcomes suffer. One clinic is thriving while the other is struggling. Why is that? Well, you can probably imagine, based on the topic of this talk, that the biggest difference is leadership. So why is leadership so important? Well, there's many reasons. One reason is mirror neurons. Mirror neurons, again, looking from the perspective of neuroscience, are these neurons that we all have that activate when we watch another person do something. They actually activate in a way. If we see someone moving in a certain way, we have neurons that activate that mirror that actually cause us to take on similar movement patterns. Or if we still see someone experiencing a certain emotion, we can actually start, through mirror neurons, start to feel that same emotion in ourselves, in our own bodies. It's the neurophysiological basis for empathy. And when are mirror neurons going to be most active? Well, they're going to be most active when observing a person of influence, someone who we really care to pay attention to. And looking at it from a perspective of evolution, who is it that has the most influence? Well, it's the leader. If you think about it, we evolved from primates, right? There's a lot of good science around evolution, and there's really good studies looking at primates, at monkeys, and how they form groups, and how those groups have an alpha. And what the alpha does, the group follows instinctively. So if the alpha washes food before eating it, for example, the rest of the group starts doing it. They mimic those actions because of mirror neurons and because of this neurophysiology. If the alpha displays confidence, the group actually feels more secure. If the alpha shows fear, the entire group actually starts to become anxious. So there's really fascinating ways in which the group tends to mirror and follow, and behave like the leader. And so as a leader, how we show up is very important. And of course, this doesn't just apply to monkeys, right? It happens in every human team, clinic, every organization. And so if leadership is so important, let's look now at how to lead most effectively. In order to do this, there's two key mindset shifts that I'm going to ask you to adopt. The first is to focus on self-mastery, and the second is to shift your focus from being an individual contributor to being more focused on developing others, because what you can achieve as a team is far greater than what you can achieve by yourself. So first, self-mastery. There's a couple quotes here that really set the stage for why this is important. The first is from Wayne Dyer, and Wayne says, "We do not attract what we want, we attract what we are." So if I'm not liking the outcomes in my life, the best thing I can do is look in the mirror and see, how am I showing up in the world that's leading to these outcomes here? What can I do differently to create different outcomes? Another quote from Brian Tracy. He says, "You don't become successful by chasing success. You become successful by becoming the kind of person who deserves success." And remember that the monkeys in the group are always looking at the alpha, just like that. You have to remember that as a leader, you are always on stage. And so it's very important to look in the mirror and see, again, how you're showing up. So the first mindset shift is self-mastery, working on personal development, because how you show up matters immensely. It's extremely important. The second point, the second mindset shift, is focusing more on developing others and being an individual contributor. And in the beginning of running a business, we often are solo entrepreneurs. And it's vitally important that we get a certain amount of things done every day. Otherwise, nothing happens in the business. So it's like pushing a boulder uphill by ourselves. It can be very taxing and grueling. Now, however, we have a whole team working with us. So there's an image, if you're watching this, you can see the image of a whole team working to bring a rock up the hill as opposed to one person pushing. And you can imagine that team can accomplish far more than the individual person can. It's also shifting from like being a player on a team to being more of a coach, from being more of a clinician to being a leader of other clinicians. So now the question becomes, what is it that makes the most effective teams? Because now we understand that as a leader, it's more about the team succeeding overall than it is about you specifically. It's about how you facilitate the overall success of the team. And the good news here is that we don't necessarily have to answer this question for ourselves, because Google already answered it for us. And by that, I don't mean doing a Google search. I mean looking at this study that appeared in the New York Times Magazine in 2016. There's a study, and the title is "What Google Learned from Its Quest to Build the Perfect Team." So they did this amazing study trying to answer the question, what is it that makes the best, most effective teams? And remember, this is Google, so they have immense resources. They take this seriously. Just to give you a sense of the scope of the study, it was a 4-year study. They had multiple PhD psychologists involved. And what they did was they surveyed over 50,000 people. They looked closely at the function, the dynamics, and the effectiveness of 180 teams. And they evaluated over 100 variables that could have influenced how effective those teams were. They looked at things like team composition. Was it a mix of skills and personality types, right? Was it important to have a proper mix of people who are more big picture oriented and more detail oriented, or a proper mix of introverts and extroverts? Well, no, it wasn't that. They looked at things like the average IQ. Was it important just to have a smarter team overall? And no, it wasn't that. Was it having a more hierarchical structure where there was a clear leader, more of a command and control, top-down type of mentality? No, it wasn't that. So perhaps it was the lack of a hierarchical structure, where it was people who were more had a dynamic of being peers rather than anyone, being over anyone else. No, it wasn't that. They looked at, was it having team members who were friends outside of work? Maybe that motivated them to do better because there was a sense of accountability, not wanting to let your friends down. No, it wasn't that. There was one variable that rose to the top among all these 100 plus variables that they looked at. And that was something called psychological safety. That was number one. And there was a top 5. So if you're watching, you can see. If you're listening, I'll just describe you. There's this pyramid of 5 keys to successful teams that came from this Google. It was called Project Aristotle. And they found these 5 things. So the base of the pyramid is psychological safety. It was the number one most important variable. And then there's above that dependability, above that structure and clarity, above that meaning of work, and then at the top, impact of work. And I think we can look at these as really 2 categories. The bottom 3 layers are all about creating a sense of predictability. And this is really important. So when we think about psychological safety, think about safety from the perspective of neuroscience. What do our brains do? Our brains are prediction machines. Our brains are constantly looking at millions of bits of information every single second, trying to scan our environment for possible sources of threat. Thinking about the basic principles of neuroscience, right? Our brains are oriented towards survival and protection. The number one priority is to make sure that we live to see tomorrow. That's more important than succeeding at work. That's more important than throwing a fastball faster or harder, jumping higher, running faster, stretching farther, right? Our brains actually try to limit us to make sure we are at less risk of injuring and harming ourselves. So the brain, in order to understand where threats might come from, is a prediction machine. It's constantly making predictions about, based on the inputs that it sees in this moment, what's going to happen next. And so predictability is very intimately related to safety. And if we look at the bottom 3 layers of this pyramid, of these 5 keys to successful teams, they're all related. Psychological safety we'll talk about in very great detail because that was number 1. But then look at dependability. If you are working on a team and you know that your teammate has something due Wednesday at 5, if you have a high degree of dependability, you can predict with a very high degree of confidence that that deliverable is going to make it in by the deadline. And then if you look at structure and clarity, this is one, there's this interesting saying from Jocko Willink, discipline equals freedom. And at first glance, they're almost the opposite. Like discipline means I have to do this, this, and this, whereas freedom, I think means I don't have to do anything. But the idea is that if you create discipline in certain core areas, you ultimately have far more freedom in areas that matter. And so here, structure and clarity creates a sense of predictability, because when you have the structure and clarity to know who's handling payroll, to make sure everyone gets paid every 2 weeks, when you know who's handling sales calls from leads and prospects coming in, who's handling customer service inquiries, who's handling doing the actual treatments, right? And what their skill set is and how they're going to get a good result almost every time because they're following certain practices. When you have that structure and clarity in place, you have a very high degree of predictability about what is going to happen day to day. And again, I mentioned psychological safety is number 1, so we're going to go into that. We're actually going to talk about a definition. This is a definition from Amy Edmondson of Harvard Business School. And she defines psychological safety as the belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. And this, I think, is actually worth picking apart a little bit or diving into a little more deeply. So first, it's a belief. Belief also means having trust, faith, or confidence in someone or something. So here, it's having trust, it's having faith that if you do something, predictability, if you speak up, you're not going to be punished or humiliated. So in other words, you are not concerned about your safety if you speak up about sharing ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. And where does this matter in the real world? Well, one example is in the operating room. So operating rooms often have these very hierarchical structures where there's a doctor or surgeon who's clearly at the top of the hierarchy. And then there's nurses, medical assistants, other people in the room that sometimes, depending on the degree of psychological safety, they may or may not be willing and able to speak up. And so there's really fascinating research showing how this influences the rate of medical errors. If the surgeon is about to operate on the wrong body part or give the wrong type or wrong amount of medication, for example, if the nurse feels enough psychological safety, he or she will speak up and say, "Hey, doctor, you're about to operate on the wrong body part." And in doing so, they can save that person from a very bad outcome, right? Having the wrong body part operated on at least, is causing damage needlessly and not fixing the problem. At worst, it can be even more severe complications. But there's also environments where there's a lack of psychological safety, and the person who notices that there's about to be a medical error, they're not going to speak up because they're concerned about questioning the doctor's authority and how that's going to be perceived. And so they don't speak up and they allow the error to happen. Similarly, in an airplane cockpit, there's also a hierarchical structure between the captain and the first officer. And so there's times where the first officer might notice something, and depending on the level of psychological safety, they may or may not be willing to speak up and share that with the captain. And of course, that can have grave consequences, right? That can mean literally the difference between life and death. There's also examples from going back to our friends at Google. Back in the 1990s, an engineer at Google suggested this 20% innovation policy, which is where employees could work on side projects for 20% of their time. So in a 5-day work week, that's 1 day a week where they're working on side projects. And they had to have enough psychological safety there for someone to be able to speak up and share that idea. And they ended up implementing that idea. And that policy led to developments like Gmail, Google Maps, AdSense, all on their own billion-dollar successes. So there's an interesting lesson here that innovation thrives in environments where employees feel safe to share their ideas and to experiment and even to fail, right? As long as it's not going to bring the whole company down, right? There has to be some sort of safety net there. So speaking of safety nets and safety and our theme of neuroscience, it's interesting to think about this question of what does safety actually look like in the brain? And in order to understand that, we have to look at a little bit of the opposite. We have to look at stress, threat, survival, and hormones like cortisol. So first of all, the relevant brain areas, there's going to be a few that we'll talk about specifically here. The first is the prefrontal cortex. So this is the most recently evolved, newest, evolutionary speaking wise, newest part of the brain that's at the front, outside, and it's that outermost layer. And this is in control of functions like decision making, conscious awareness. It's how we know when we talk about being aware of how we're feeling, being aware of ourselves. This is where that happens, that special human sense that we have. It's also the seat of focus and attention and executive function and impulse control. So if you've ever said or done something that you later regretted because of anger, because of the emotional state you were in, that's a lack of impulse control in that moment. So the prefrontal cortex, very important for the functions that make us human, the functions that make us effective humans, that help us be good in relationships, help us be good leaders. And then lower down in the brain, there's these other areas in the more in the limbic system and in the more so-called reptilian, deepest parts of the brain. So a few that we're going to talk about. One is the hippocampus, which if you're looking at the image is this lower area that is kind of tan in color, but it's deep in towards the center of the brain. It's related to memory and learning. And then just above that is the thalamus, which is the sensory relay station. It takes in all sensory input from the body and then relays it to different parts of the brain, one of which is the amygdala. So the amygdala is monitoring all of that sensory input into the thalamus, and it's monitoring it for potential sources of threat. And when it detects a threat, of course, it triggers a fight or flight response, triggers a sympathetic response to mobilize energy to meet that threat. And then there's one other part that we'll talk about here called the cingulate gyrus. There's an anterior cingulate cortex, a posterior cingulate cortex. And this is interesting because it's the bridge between the limbic system that we just talked about and the prefrontal cortex, which we talked about earlier. It's that bridge between the limbic system is also the emotional system of the brain, between emotions and rational decision making, that bridge. And the anterior cortex is specifically related to emotional regulation and decision making, while the posterior is more related to memory retrieval and then specifically that quality of self-awareness. So let's look at what happens to these parts of the brain when there is a perception of threat, when there's stress. First, in the prefrontal cortex, decision making and impulse control are impaired. So this can lead to rash decisions, reduced creativity, and certainly poor leadership. But it can be problematic in anybody. If anyone on your team doesn't feel safe, you're not going to be getting their best thinking, their best planning, their best function. The hippocampus, when this is under stress, this, remember, is related to memory and learning. So under stress, it actually leads to reduced or impaired ability in the realm of memory and learning. So it can lead to forgetfulness, difficulty retaining skills. So if you're trying to help your therapists learn to be better therapists and learn new skills, the sense of safety is very important here, because without it, they're going to be impaired. Their memory and their ability to learn new skills is going to be impaired. Next is the amygdala. So under stress, this, of course, as we talked about, is going to make one more emotionally reactive, more fearful. It's going to lead to workplace anxiety. It's going to lead to the avoidance of taking risks or trying new things. It can lead to conflict as well. So, it can be very problematic. When the cingulate gyrus that we talked about, or the anterior cingulate cortex, when under stress, this is impaired, leads to impaired emotional regulation. So that also can lead to more workplace conflicts and lower empathy overall. So if you want your therapist, for example, to be empathetic when talking to patients, which I believe as practice owners, we all do, that's very important there. But they themselves need to feel safe first in order to be able to have empathy when interacting with your patients, with your customers. Let's talk next about neurochemistry. So we talked about different brain areas, but it's also interesting and instructive to talk about the neurochemistry. So we're going to talk about two categories of neuromodulators or neurotransmitters. The first is going to be serotonin and oxytocin, which are related to safety, and then dopamine, which is more related to motivation. First, we'll talk about serotonin and oxytocin on this topic of safety. So serotonin, first of all, it's more than just mood and depression. We know about SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, that increase the activity of serotonin in someone who's depressed, and it helps them be less depressed, right? So there's this relationship between serotonin and feeling good or not feeling good. So that is important. And serotonin, when one feels safe, they tend to feel better and be less depressed. And there's also more to it than that, because it's also important for learning and memory, for executive function, for sleep, for feeling confident. So it's very important. Safety is some of the underlying neurophysiology of how that sense of safety is related to all of these other qualities. It's also very interesting to look at the amygdala, which we talked about here. We talked about how it is the brain's fear center and how it triggers the fight or flight response, that sympathetic nervous system response, how it leads to emotional reactivity and defensive behavior. It also creates tunnel vision. When one is under threat, it narrows the peripheral field, and we focus more, trying to focus on that immediate source of threat, that immediate challenge, that immediate threat, so that we can attempt to fight or flee and ensure our survival. And when this happens, it's called amygdala hijack, when the amygdala takes over. And this is a term coined by Daniel Goleman, who also coined the term emotional intelligence. So he's had a profound influence on the field of psychology. And when amygdala hijack happens, it's like that character from, if you've seen Inside Out, where the different emotions are inside the brain of the little girl and her parents. And anger, you may remember the red character with the flames coming out of his head. When amygdala hijack happens, it's like being taken over. But there's this fascinating shift that can happen when oxytocin is present, and when there's a feeling of safety, the function of the amygdala can actually switch. It's kind of crazy, but these fMRI images show that when there's enough safety and enough oxytocin present, remember we talked about serotonin and oxytocin as these important neuromodulators here that are related to this sense of psychological safety. When there's enough oxytocin present, the amygdala's function switches from fear tracking to reinforcing positive social bonds. It uses all this amazing neurological circuitry to start building and sustaining social bonds by doing things like tracking members of the group, tuning into interactions. It sets the stage for meaningful engagement. It's like transforming from a vicious guard dog to a more friendly guide dog. So it's this really, really amazing thing. You can see it lighting up differently on fMRI imaging. So now there's the question of, okay, there's wonderful things can happen when we create psychological safety. How do we actually create psychological safety? Well, there's a few ways. One is that we ourselves as leaders can actually be safe to be around. This is very important. Two is effective communication. We'll talk about some strategies for that. And three is cultivating a sense of trust and belonging. So first we'll talk about the importance of actually just being safe to be around and how that creates a sense of psychological safety. So remember, we talked about how the leader is always on stage, and this gets back to that theme of the importance of self-mastery, the theme of emotional regulation, because if you can imagine if we as leaders just have a short fuse and we're yelling at everybody, how difficult is it for the people on our team to have that sense of predictability? They don't know if they're going to get the nice version of us or the screaming and yelling version of us, so they can't predict. So they inherently feel unsafe, and their performance is going to suffer for all of the reasons that we talked about. And so this is where the work on ourselves becomes very important. There's one thing that I don't know how the degree to which I've talked about it on this podcast so far, but one of my favorite themes to think about is that running a business, I believe, is a spiritual practice. Think about what comes up and what we have to deal with as business owners. There's existential threats of survival. Are we going to make it? And how do we cope with that? There's interpersonal issues, right? There's all these areas where our learned patterns come up. For me, it's patterns like people pleasing and difficulty setting boundaries. And this is where work on ourselves becomes really important. And that can be work like doing therapy, doing EMDR to deal with traumas that might still be living in our system and causing us to act out in certain ways. It can be practices like meditation, which have been very beneficial for me. And there's a few books that I want to share on the topic of meditation. Two are Waking Up by Sam Harris and Stop Missing Your Life by Cory Muscara. And then a third book that's really relevant here is No Bad Parts. It's the book by Richard Schwartz that describes his system in psychology known as internal family systems. And what that internal family systems is this framework that talks about how we all have a self with a capital S, that at our core, this self is complete, it's full, it doesn't need outside validation, it's happy, it's curious, it's content, it's compassionate, it connects with other people. And then we have these parts, these little parts of our psychology that act in certain ways in order to get love, to feel a sense of belonging. So that could be the patterns I talked about, for example, like people pleasing, difficulty setting boundaries. It could be that need to always put on a happy face, or that need to never be angry, or it could be learned patterns of not allowing oneself to rest, for example, because in your house, rest or recreation was always seen as bad, and you needed to always be working and compulsively working and doing something, right? It could be different things like that. But there's these fascinating patterns that comes up, and those are parts in our psychology. So it's a wonderful book, wonderful system, highly recommended. And that wraps up this first part of being safe to be around and the work we can do on ourselves to cultivate psychological safety in the people that we work with by being safe ourselves. The second part to this, second strategy, if you will, to create a sense of psychological safety is effective communication. And so tactically, this can mean things like, speaking in close proximity, making eye contact and touch, having touch, workplace appropriate touch, like handshakes, pats on the shoulder, pat on the back, that sort of thing. Having energetic exchanges in the office, creating safe, collision-rich spaces. That doesn't mean colliding with each other, but it means having larger lunch tables where more people can sit together, having the interactions at the water cooler, right? When we're talking with someone, really over communicating, listening, focusing and making it clear that listening is the number one priority in that moment. That means things like avoiding distractions, not being looking at your cell phone or things like that, because people can tell when you're really present with them. It also means doing things like making sure everyone has a voice. So if you're in meetings as a team, sometimes you have to spotlight people who don't always speak up and get their voice heard, making sure everyone has a voice, everyone gets to be heard in meetings, and making sure everyone has a chance to meet one-on-one with whomever they report to. We call that, instead of a direct report, a direct support. And there's 2 wonderful books on effective communication in the workplace or even in life, right? These skills, all interpersonal skills in the workplace, help you be better in romantic relationships, better parents, etc. But 2 books that I really like are Radical Candor by Kim Scott and Dare to Lead by Brené Brown. And just one personal experience here that I'll share. We've read these books as a team at NeuFit in a book club where everyone reads it. We come together to discuss it. And that's been such a wonderful experience, because it's almost like a hack for more effective communication, because everyone's on the same page about why this type of communication is important. So they're open to talking in this way. And then it's almost like having training wheels. It's like having a script. If I'm going to have an uncomfortable conversation, which for me, with those people-pleasing tendencies and difficulty setting boundaries, is actually very difficult, to have the training wheels of that script of knowing exactly what to say, how to launch into that conversation, how to have that conversation, is extremely helpful. And these books, has been very valuable for us. So I highly recommend, highly encourage you to do something similar. Find a book like this and do a book club. Read them together as a team. Come together and talk about them. So you all have the same tools, the same language, the same framework to be more effective communicators. Again, with an eye towards creating a sense of psychological safety. And then the third category of ways to create that sense of psychological safety is to cultivate a sense of trust and belonging. Another great book that I'll mention here is The Speed of Trust by Stephen Covey. And in that book, he talks about 10 ways to create trust. One is to act with integrity. So if you tell the truth and you keep your commitments, you are going to cultivate a sense of trust. Also, admitting mistakes quickly, taking responsibility is another way to do that. Number 2 is demonstrating competence. People trust leaders who perform and get results. So keep learning, keep improving, keep cultivating your own expertise, have that growth mindset. Number 3 is show respect. Treat people with dignity regardless of their position. When you do that, when you practice active listening, when you acknowledge everyone's contributions and ideas, even, especially from the quietest voices like we talked about earlier, when you do that, when you show respect, you engender trust. The 4th is to clarify expectations. So mismatched expectations are a major cause of broken trust. The more clearly you can define roles, responsibilities, and goals for the team, the more you create, back to predictability, the more you create a sense of predictability and confidence and safety, and also trust. 5 in his list is create accountability. Trust is strengthened when leaders hold themselves to the same standard as the team. So I don't want to, be able to go act in some sort of different way and not have the same standards of behavior and integrity as everybody else, right? As the leader, I need to be able to hold myself to those same standards and have accountability. I need to be able to give honest feedback. I also need to be able to accept it from others, even seek it out from others. And we'll talk about some questions and some conversation topics in one-on-one meetings with the people who report to you that you can ask as well to make sure the accountability runs both ways, because that is a major way to cultivate trust. Number 6 is extending trust. If you want someone to be trustworthy, you have to trust them. So giving trust is a good way to earn trust. And this really is about avoiding micromanaging. It's about empowering others with responsibility. When you show them trust, they're more likely to live up to that trust and earn that trust, and they're more likely to trust you in return. Number 7 is to communicate clearly. Trust grows when people feel informed and included. So instead of hiding things that might be going on, share them with the team and explain challenges honestly and openly, and work together to create a recovery plan if there's an issue in the business. Give credit and show loyalty. So a leader who takes credit for others' work loses trust, right? That's the opposite of what we want. The more you can give recognition to your team for the work that they do, the ideas they have, the things they execute on, the achievements that they achieve, the more you can do that, give that recognition, and the more publicly you can do that, the better. That is a very powerful way to cultivate a sense of trust. And then number 9 is to be consistent. Remember, this is predictability. The more consistent that you are, the more you act with integrity, the more consistently you show up, the less people have to wonder which version of you they're going to get, the more trust there's going to be. And then finally, keeping your commitments, right? Trust is lost when people break promises, they overpromise and underdeliver. So it's really important that you keep your promises, and it's really important to have the foresight here to only commit to what you can deliver on. So that's a very important part of trust, keeping your commitments.
Thank you so much for listening to the Undercurrent podcast. If you're interested in learning more about how NeuFit and the newbie can impact your life, please visit our website at www.neu.fit, that's neu.fit, so you can learn more about how it might integrate into your professional practice, how you can use it as a patient, and you can also connect with our team there.
And there's another theme here that emerges as we talk about this concept of trust, and that's vulnerability. In many ways, vulnerability precedes trust. If you think about it, by definition, if you're trusting another person to do something, that means in some way you're admitting that you can't or you're not able to do it yourself. So vulnerability isn't weakness. It's actually a prerequisite for effective teamwork. It's the willingness to be open, to ask for help, also the willingness to admit mistakes and take risks and admit that you don't know the answer or that you messed up. It's one of the most powerful ways to create trust within a team. And if you want to have a sense of vulnerability, it's important that as a leader, you demonstrate vulnerability. Remember, we talked about how we're always on stage, talking about mirror neurons, right? If we want people on our team to be vulnerable when it's appropriate, we have to lead by showing vulnerability. So what are some ways to do that? One way that I really like is, and this is a way for me to slide in another book recommendation here. I think that brings us to 7 or 8 book recommendations at this point. But one that we read together as a team at NeuFit called The 6 Types of Working Genius. And this is very cool because it breaks up any work-related project or any project, at home or otherwise, into these different phases, like wondering about the problem and then inventing a solution and then discerning and picking the right solution and galvanizing the group to take action on the proposed solution and then enabling the process of work to get started and then tenacity to get it across the finish line. So there's these stages, and there's this fascinating dynamic where any individual person, even the most talented leader, to everyone on the org chart, can only have 2 areas of working genius. And so when I get up in front of our team at NeuFit and I say, my areas of my working geniuses are wonder and discernment, I'm really good at those, but these other 4, I'm not so good at. So at the very least, I need you, right? I'm vulnerable enough to admit that I need you on the team to fill in for these areas where I'm not as good. I'm just not naturally as good. I'm not as interested in doing it. And, you are better at these areas. You're better at these other 4. And so we can be better together as a team because you're going to be working well in the areas where I'm not as effective. I'm going to be working well in some of these areas where you're not as effective. And together, we're going to be awesome. So that, I think, is a really powerful type of vulnerability. And you also are feeding 2 birds from the same hand because you're also figuring out how to create very effective working dynamics where everyone on the team can complement each other. There's also a good way to cultivate a sense of vulnerability and therefore trust and a psychological safety by asking certain questions. Remember, we talked about the value of making sure everyone on your team has regular one-on-one meetings with their direct support. So one question that you can ask in one-on-one meetings is about what things that are going right. What is one thing I currently do as your leader, right? What is one thing I currently do that you would like me to continue doing? Good question. And then pause and listen. Second question is more about things that aren't working as well. What is one thing that I don't currently do or don't do frequently enough that you think I should do or that I should do more often? Good question. Finally, what can I do to make you more effective? And this is really powerful because this communicates that my job as a leader is to make sure that you, as the person reporting to me, to make sure that you are as effective as you can possibly be in your role. I love these questions. If you need to go back and write them down, I think it's worth doing. I encourage you to use these. Not every week, of course, but maybe once a quarter if you have a more in-depth check-in with the people who you meet with regularly. And then remember we talked about trust and belonging. Now we're going to go to belonging, creating belonging cues so that people feel like they belong, because that's one of our most primitive needs, right? From the perspective of neuroscience and psychological safety and survival, we need to know that we belong to a group, because we're far more likely to survive when we're together with our group, with our tribe, with our community, than we are if we're off by ourselves, right? If we're by ourselves, we're more likely to get injured, get eaten, right? Whatever it might be. So there's a great example from our friends at Google. Going back to Google, they have, and there's a picture here if you're watching, but if you're listening, you can envision at their headquarters in Silicon Valley, they have a hockey rink, a street hockey rink, and they have these hockey games there where employees from all levels, from the janitors to the mid-level managers, even to the CEO, CFO, COO, they come together to play hockey games. And this shared space, it breaks down hierarchical barriers, it encourages open communication and mutual respect, and it really cultivates a sense of community where it makes everyone feel valued, feel connected, which is essential for creating a thriving organizational culture. And at NeuFit, we do things like go play Topgolf, go play pickleball. We do pictures where if you're watching, you can see this. If not, you can see a picture of us where we're doing a team photo and we're all in these poses where we're showing that, our culture of being fun. I have pictures also from our team holiday party where there's one of me with Sam, one of the trainers at our office in Austin, and several of the women on our team who were dressed up for the holiday party. And doing these things together, creates this sense of belonging, of being part of something greater than ourselves. There's a picture of me with a few other colleagues working at an event, and we're wearing these NeuFit baseball jerseys. So these different branded apparel items that we have made. These are cues. These are items that cultivate this sense of belonging, right? What do the New York Yankees wear? They all wear Yankees jerseys, right? Well, what does Team NeuFit wear? We wear jerseys or shirts or things with our logo on it, right? We're a team. So now we've talked about these 5 things. We talked about the base of the pyramid of these 3 things that are related to psychological safety, going back to the results from the Google study, right? We talked about these 3 things related to psychological safety and predictability and that sense of belonging. Now, I just want to talk for a moment about these other 2, these top 2 areas of the pyramid, the meaning of work and the impact of work. So this talks more to this sense of mission and purpose. It talks for people on the team, thinking about who they are and is this work aligned with who they are. And we get into this question of who I am, who am I? We get into an extremely powerful psychological concept of identity. And part of why identity is so powerful is that it shapes your thoughts and beliefs. And then your thoughts and beliefs, of course, inform your behaviors, which leads to all of the outcomes in your life, or influences profoundly the outcomes in your life, right? Some bad things might be unlucky, but what we want to do is look in the mirror and see how our behaviors influence the outcomes in our life. And so this gets into that other, back to when we're talking about neurochemistry, we had talked about serotonin and oxytocin being related to safety, causing all these wonderful qualities, oxytocin even causing the amygdala to switch its function in some profound ways. Now we get into dopamine, because dopamine is a powerful motivator. That can give us the energy to run through walls, right? To endure hardship, to do what needs to be done to achieve an outcome. And so this sense of purpose is intimately related to dopamine. And I love the example that our friends at Apex Physical Therapy, the example of how they do this, how they create that sense of identity. So I have a few screenshots from their website. On their recruiting page, it says, join our tribe. And it says underneath exactly what they're doing, changing lives and challenging the status quo. it says that same line on their page about diagnostics, their page about NeuFit, changing lives and challenging the status quo. So creating this sense of identity is very important, because when we do something, when we have a sense of identity of who we desire to be, and then we find ways of living into that, that initiates the release of dopamine, and that is very energizing, motivating, satisfying, and it's in a profound and a deeply neurological way. So I love the way that they do that, and that sense of identity. Speaking to that is one of the biggest domino, kind of the first domino, the biggest levers in this conversation about motivation, energy, and things like that. And there's another really powerful concept to talk about here, and that's the effect of storytelling on the brain. So storytelling can be a very powerful tool here when we talk about the sense of mission and purpose and the meaning of the work. And stories are really interesting from a neurological perspective because they activate more brain regions than when we just hear facts and data. When we hear facts and data, the language processing parts of the brain are active, but stories engage more brain regions. They engage the sensory and motor and emotional centers of the brain, so they actually feel real to the listener. And storytelling also creates neural coupling. Remember we talked about mirror neurons? Well, when someone is listening to a story, their brain activity begins to mirror that of the storytellers. So it's like they're experiencing it themselves, but it also creates this deep sense of connection and alignment between the person listening to the story and the person telling the story. And there's some really powerful ways that you can harness the power of storytelling in your practice or in your business. One of them is telling your origin story. Whenever we hire new people at NeuFit, I find a way to tell them our origin story at NeuFit. I talk to them about the experiences I had growing up as an athlete and dealing with injuries, and how I was so frustrated, so disenfranchised with traditional physical therapy, traditional orthopedic medicine, where at one point I thought about going pre-med, but I just didn't feel like that was a possible avenue for me based on those experiences. So I ended up becoming an engineer. And then I had this experience where I was playing college ice hockey. I was supposed to have a surgery to repair some ligaments, and I met a doctor who was doing functional neurology and using older versions of direct current. And this changed my life, because I learned firsthand about the importance of the nervous system and how it influences the healing process, even when there's tissue damage, even when it's more of a hardware-based injury. The software of the nervous system is vitally important for supporting that, both locally and also globally in terms of the autonomic nervous system. And I saw also firsthand how direct current, it was older, more primitive, analog direct current, more like microcurrent device at the time, but how that was able to literally cause my ligaments to heal, help me avoid surgery. And it was so, it was just so wonderful for me, not only because I got back out on the ice, I was happy as an athlete, but as a physics major, as a pre-engineering student, to find something that made sense scientifically from first principles, and also spoke to this feeling that I had where I couldn't really put the words to it at the time, but I felt like we just had, as human beings, more of this life force, more of this healing potential within us. And, just taking an anti-inflammatory, resting, bracing, needing surgery, these things that were offered to me as solutions never really felt like they tapped into that life force that I believed we all had and believe still that we all have. And so, when I talk about that, and then I talk about how that led me on my journey to, work in practice here in Austin for 8 or 9 years, and during that time go back for additional graduate school in neuroscience, and then ultimately decide to create the newbie and launch that. And so there's elements of that story that speak to, people being frustrated with the traditional medical model and wanting to work to find solutions and finding ways to leverage technology and neuroscience to help their patients do better and get better outcomes and feel better faster, and all these, when there's these different parts of this that speak to them, and if that speaks to them, then they feel excited to be a part of it. And there's also different, we can tell stories around our core values. And we also can have, like core values, and then we can have guidelines. Like one of the things that we talk about at our clinic in Austin is we want our environment to shine. And that's an acronym where we talk about being supportive. We talk about healing. We talk about having an inspirational quality, about a nurturing quality, and encouraging. So our shine environment, supportive, healing, inspirational, nurturing, and encouraging. And this speaks to, again, who we are, how we show up, every day. And as we wind down here, I want to leave you with one final story about leadership. Many of you may know who Greg Popovich is. He's the longtime coach of the San Antonio Spurs. He's won 5 NBA titles, one of the most successful NBA coaches of all time. And every season he does something really unexpected. He personally thanks his players for allowing him to coach them. So think about how valued that makes them feel and how humble and vulnerable he is in that moment. He's not holding his power over his players, coercing them into performing. Instead, he's acknowledging that they are autonomous adults and that they are choosing of their own free will to be there with him. Because he knows that leadership is not about power or control, it's about trust and connection. So he's one of the best in the world at creating a team where people feel valued, respected, and inspired to give their best. So now I invite you to imagine your business. Heck, imagine a world where leaders understand these principles. Think about in your business how your team will perform when they feel safe to share ideas and you end up getting all the best ideas into the mix for discussion and consideration. Think about how your team performs when they trust in the direction of the business, and that allows them to simply focus on their performance and to show up with their best every day. Think about when every person on your team wakes up knowing they're contributing to something greater than themselves, how motivated they are, how much energy they're going to have, right? Tapping into that dopamine, that source of neural energy. Well, the future starts with us as leaders. It starts with how we show up every day. And so my challenge to you is this: what kind of leader will you choose to be? Thank you so much for tuning into this episode. I hope you found it as interesting as I did in going through and researching this and learning a lot about it. And I'm excited to hear your takeaways and what resonated most with you. So please send me a DM, leave it in the comments here, and we will see you on the next episode of the Undercurrent Podcast.